For many decades, we worried about population growth. The global population was soaring. But then things started to change very quickly. The latest UN forecasts suggest that the world population is forecast to plummet in the coming decades. The world is going to change. By 2050, there will be more people in 2 African countries than the entire European continent. However, bucking these global forecasts, the UK's ONS claim that the UK population will continue to rise from 67 to 78 million by 2050. If this is true, the UK would become the largest European country by population. However, the ONS have a track record of overestimating fertility rates. They assume fertility rates stay the same, but they don't. They keep falling, like the rest of Europe. British people are having fewer children, and this trend is, if anything, speeding up. The Global Burden of Disease study found that UK fertility is likely to fall from a current 1.5 to just 1.2, similar to the rate in other European countries. This has never happened before. It is unprecedented territory for a developed economy. And it raises the question, are we ready for such a scenario? Compared to other European countries, UK fertility rates are fairly average. However, this is still significantly less than the replacement rate of 2.1. And more importantly, recent trends have all been towards falling birth rates. There are 5 main factors causing this. Firstly, the cost of having children has risen significantly. In 2022, if you include housing and childcare costs, the average cost of raising a child to 18 is an estimated $230,000. That works out to $12,400 a year. But even at the age of 18, the cost of children doesn't end. The end of free tuition fees has caused families to spend more on fees and support. And even after university, you could argue the cost doesn't end there. Many parents feel an obligation to help their children onto the housing market or even help pay rent. And this brings us to the second big factor behind falling birth rates: the housing market as an economic barrier. As a share of income, house prices have risen to near record levels. To save for a deposit takes 18 years. There's a clear economic rationale to not having children, or at least having smaller families. For example, it's much more manageable to get a 2-bed house than to get a 4-bedroomed house. Who can afford to have a large family these days? Now, at this point, my Yorkshire grandparents may say, well, we used to have it tough, we used to sleep 4 to a room back in the day and we were the lucky ones. But we can't ignore the fact expectations have changed in the past 60 years. A key factor in falling global fertility rates is a rise in female education, greater access to family planning. In the UK, female participation in the labour market has increased from 57% to 78% in 2017, and it continues to rise. Fifthly, there are also other factors at play too. For example, it's increasingly common for people to raise concerns about climate change or global instability as a reason not to have children. 48% in the UK have expressed this as a concern and reason to not have children. Birth rates are falling, and the UK is definitely going to age. The share of a population over 65 is going to nearly double from 27 to 57%. This will profoundly affect the economy. The first and most obvious impact is that of government finances, which will be even more stretched than they are at the moment. Pension spending has risen in recent years, but the forecast is for perhaps more unsustainable increases in pension and healthcare spending. Recently, the UK government announced the end of the pension winter fuel discount, saving an estimated £2 billion. But this is really a drop in the ocean compared to the pension spending that will come in future years. One analysis suggests that the only way to make pensions affordable is to raise the retirement age all the way to 70. To understand the logic of this, under current trends of lower fertility, the dependency ratio is forecast to rise from 54% to 100%. That means that in the future, for every non-working person, there will only be one worker. Don't forget the state pension is not an investment, but is paid for out of current revenue. And this raises the prospect of higher taxes on the working population. It's a kind of demographic pressure which is very unwelcome. In recent years, UK debt has risen to nearly 100% of GDP. Now, this is okay if you have a growing working age population and strong economic growth. But if you don't, and you have an ageing population, it does start to become unsustainable, and it can create a negative cycle of higher debt and lower growth. Now, having said all that, when we worry about a falling population, we instinctively think of all the negative aspects. But a decline in the population would definitely have some brighter aspects. Firstly, a fall in the population would reduce pressure on the housing market. Given the growth in the number of households, the UK faces an estimated shortage of 4 million homes. With slower population growth, it would help to ease this shortage. And in theory, if we did get a lower population, lower house prices, then it would make the housing market much more affordable. And if anything could reverse falling fertility trends, more affordable housing would play a very key role. Secondly, there is a general sense of overcrowding. Roads and trains are overcrowded, greenbelt land is earmarked for new housing, tourist spots are overcrowded. A decline in the population would ease many of these problems. A fall in the population would also ease some of our environmental problems. Fewer emissions, less demand for water and natural resources would all ease pressure on the environment. We've really struggled to limit consumption and emissions in recent years. We just don't like doing it. So lower population growth in a way would do the heavy lifting of reducing things like CO2 emissions. Now that's all very well, but getting to this nirvana of a smaller population could actually be quite difficult. The fall in fertility rates is forecast to be so extreme, it will lead to unbalanced societies. Schools will close, but we'll need more retirement homes, but without the people to work there. Now, of course, to some extent, technology can go some way to dealing with the decline in the population. Robots and artificial intelligence could treat the old and infirm. But is this a future we would look forward to, being looked after by an inanimate robot? And I think it is worth stressing, and this isn't sensationalist, but there's a very real risk that fertility rates could fall even faster than current forecasts. If you look at countries like South Korea, Malta, Singapore and Hong Kong, they all have fertility rates of 1 or less, and this starts to get really serious. And could anything be done to reverse this trend to having fewer children in society? Well, unfortunately, evidence suggests not very much at all. Even countries which have promoted aggressive pronatal policies have only seen a very limited increase in birth rates. It seems that even cash subsidies and better childcare do very little to move the dial. The Global Burden of Disease reports that pronatal policies could lead to a minor one-off increase in the birth rate, but it wouldn't change the long-term downward trend. Which brings us to the topic of immigration. One reason for the growth in the UK population is immigration, currently accounts for around 50% of population growth. Now, as migrants tend to be closer to working age, it is a foil to some extent of the ageing population. It helps to reduce that tendency towards a higher dependency ratio. In fact, if there's one simple policy to deal with an ageing population, it is to encourage immigration. It is why countries like Japan and South Korea are starting to relax their decade-long reluctance to allow foreigners in. Yet, whilst migration can play a role in easing the pressures on government finances and shortage of workers, it's not without its own stresses. The recent record rise in immigration did see upward pressure on rent and house prices, adding to the existing housing crisis rather than solve it. Here the problem is one of magnitude. Last year, the end of COVID and the Ukraine crisis saw 700,000 migrants, which is quite a high share of the population, quite hard to absorb. But should the working age population start to shrink, immigration will always remain a kind of get out clause. But, interestingly, if population does fall as much as some of the worst case scenarios predict, it may well be that it's actually harder to attract immigrants than in the past. We'll have to see. One big question is what will happen to the economy. Can the UK economy start to grow again? Because in the past 14 years, we kind of got stuck in a cycle of low growth, which is going to exacerbate the problems of an ageing population. This video explains what went wrong.